Welcome back to Capitol Tonight. Now, in addition to those old standby budget battle sticking points, education and healthcare funding, and then the new debate over prison closures, rent regulation has emerged as a potential hurdle on the path to an on-time budget this year. Governor Cuomo initially opposed the idea of linking the rent laws, a mostly downstate concern, to the upstate issue of property tax relief in the form of a cap. And then last week he changed his mind, saying the two were, quote, connected and should be in the budget. And then yesterday, Cuomo pivoted yet again, saying that neither the cap nor the rent laws would be likely to be included in the final budget deal. This is very confusing, so I'm joined now by Michael McKee. He is a veteran housing advocate and spokesman for the Real Rent Reform Now campaign. He's here to try and help us make sense of this debate. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Liz.
Okay, first, if you would, because upstate viewers obviously are not as engaged on this issue as downstaters are, explain to us the main points of the argument.
Well, first of all, rent regulation used to be a statewide program and used to have rent control departments in the Capital District, for example. I don't think there are any left. They've all been phased out over time. But right now, rent regulation is a downstate issue. It applies in the city of New York, as well as the 3 suburban counties surrounding the city, Nassau, Rockland, and Westchester. And there's about 35,000 rent control departments left. Those are being phased out and transitioned into rent-stabilized apartments over time. And there's about 1.1 million rent-stabilized apartments in the city and suburbs. Housing, and total population is about 2.5 million in the city. So it's like a third of the city lives in rent-regulated housing.
What's the difference between control versus stabilization?
Well, the differences are less important than the similarities. They both regulate how much and how often the rent can go up, and they give tenants the right of tenure, the right to remain in your apartment as long as you don't do something wrong.
Right.
You know, if you are a bad tenant, you can be evicted for cause. But unregulated tenants can be evicted for any reason or no reason. The landlord can simply say, I'm terminating your tenancy, I'm not going to renew your lease.
I want to go co-op, I want to sell the building.
I want to move my mother into your apartment, or I found somebody who can pay $1,000 a month more than you. So rent-regulated tenants have basic protections that other tenants don't. And that's the same whether it's rent-controlled or rent-stabilized. I mean, the differences are based on when the building was built. Rent control is pre-war housing, meaning housing built before 1947. Rent stabilization used to be post-war housing. Now it's pre-war and post-war.
So I think that most people who are watching right now understand that New York City is very expensive, understand that it's not easy to find an apartment there. I've lived there. It's a tough place to find an apartment, much less an apartment that you can afford. The problem is that we see these stories like things about Charlie Rangel, for example, the congressman in Harlem who had 4 controlled apartments.
And using one of them for an office.
Right, which is not
even using
legal.
it as an apartment.
But it's up to...
Well, he gave that one up.
He did. Yeah. But he wouldn't have had it not been exposed.
No, certainly not.
But still the problem is, so it gives this idea, he gives the whole program a bad rap, if you will, because people are abusing it. And look, I know people, it's like the holy grail to find yourself an apartment that is affordable.
You should understand I'm not defending Congressman Rangel's living arrangement at all. In fact, I think it's not right that somebody should have 3 or 4 apartments, especially if one's not being used for living. But you should understand that the basic apartment that he and his wife rented had already been made into 2. It was 2 apartments made into 1 by the landlord before he moved in. And for some reason, that landlord, this is the landlord of Lenox Terrace, which is a very large middle-class apartment complex in Harlem, and I'm very familiar with it. I work with the tenants association there all the time. For some reason, that landlord never filed the plans to make that into 1 apartment. So 2 of the 3 apartments is actually 1 apartment that used to be 2 apartments.
But the vast majority of people who are living
have 1 apartment.
Have 1 apartment. Besides that,
and have a hard time holding on to it.
In apartments that actually are falling underneath this idea of rent regulations are people who have a median income that's quite low. Is that correct?
The median household income for rent-regulated tenants is $38,000 a year. That means half of the families living in rent-regulated apartments have an annual household income of less than $38,000. Now, in New York City, that's basically poverty level. I mean, it's hard for me to understand how people can pay 50 and 75% of their income for rent, but I know people who do.
And this is...
I have a very good friend who pays 75% of her income for rent.
And
that's because of the weakening of the rent laws. That's not because of rent regulation, it's because they've been weakened.
And they're also actually set to sunset entirely.
That's
correct.
The
whole thing. So this is a budget battle that we've seen before. We've seen the budget held up for months over this the last time around.
Well, we've never seen it dealt with in the budget. Rent regulation has never been treated as a part of the budget. In 1997, Speaker Shelley Silver said he would not pass the budget until the rent laws were renewed because Joe Bruno, the majority leader of the Senate, was saying he was not going to renew the rent laws when they came up for renewal in June. So it wasn't that they were made part of the budget, it's just that Shelley Silver, God bless him, and we're very glad that he did this. We would have been in very serious trouble if he had not, said, I won't pass the budget until the Senate passes the renewal of the rent laws.
But it's a totally different situation now. I mean, do you envision, you were here today to have a press conference with a number of people who are in the Assembly Democratic Conference.
Senate.
I'm looking at and Senate, yes. I'm looking at the quotes. I mean, there's a good 8 or 10 quotes from various different Democrats.
I think there are like 25 legislators there.
Will they dig in their heels and say, we will not pass this budget, shut down the government, Shelley? We prefer to see you do that.
This is a question, and I think it might come to that. I mean, I can't speak for any legislator. I mean, that's the decision they have to make. And of course,
but would you want them to, Michael? Would you want them to shut down the government?
I want them to do whatever they have to do to make sure that not only that the rent laws get renewed, because we're always in danger in a sunset year when the laws come up for renewal, we're always in danger of additional weakening amendments. I want them to take whatever steps they have to take to make sure those laws not only get renewed, but that we close some of the loopholes that have been put into the laws in the last 20 years that have caused us to lose 300,000 rent-regulated apartments in the last 14 years.
And that's based on luxury decontrol and
there's no such thing as luxury decontrol. That's what the landlords call it. It's high rent vacancy decontrol is the main mechanism. We calculate 300,000 apartments have been deregulated simply because the apartment became vacant. And that means that the tenant moving into that apartment has no basic rights.
Okay, but do you not think that it would actually exacerbate the upstate-downstate divide if people in New York City got together and said, you know what, shut down the state government to protect tenants'
We certainly
rights?
don't want to see state employees not get paid. I mean, come on. I mean, we have very important allies in the labor union movement, and in the downstate region, several of the unions are very much involved in the real rent reform campaign, and that's because their members live in rent-regulated housing. I mean, there's no place else for people to live.
But you really think it could come down to this?
It might. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the governor meant yesterday when he said, after only 4 days or so after saying that he thought it should be done in the budget, that he doesn't think it's going to be done in the budget. He didn't say it's not going to be done in the budget. He said he didn't think as a realistic that it was going to be in the budget. But, you know, this guy plays three-dimensional chess. I mean, he's very smart and he's very calculating. He probably has some grand plan whereby he's going to, you know, make Shelley Silver buy this and, you know, trade this and trade that. I don't know. But we're certainly saying that our best leverage is if this is done as part of the budget negotiation. We are very much afraid that if we come down to June 15th, when the laws actually are up for renewal, the classic Senate Republican strategy is to let the clock tick. People get nervous, and then they say, okay, we'll renew the rent laws for another X years, but you have to swallow these additional weakening amendments that basically is destroying the system. And I might remind you that in 2003, the last time these laws came up for renewal, Senate Majority Leader Joe Bruno said repeatedly, we are not going to weaken the laws further, we're going to renew them as is. And then on the last night of the session, the very last night, he came out with a bill that had additional weakening amendments and renewed the laws for 8 years.
Well, we are unfortunately out of time. I predict that this is going to come down to the wire, just like it did last time. I would not be surprised. Michael McKee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Liz.